I think another important thing a fiscal map does is it allows you to make the case about the equity of resource distribution. So you could potentially show that your community isn't getting its fair percentage of support for different types of programs. But obviously you have to gather the data on how funding is distributed before you can take that next step to make that case. Another way to maximize public revenue would be to think about connections with other initiatives and coalitions, because if you build these types of partnerships, you can often piggyback on other proposals and programs. So even though one of the challenges of working with issues around children exposed to violence is that it does cover such a large area of issues and stakeholders, that's also another way to think of it is it gives you a broader range of entry points to connect with other groups. And so I think sometimes there's a tendency for initiatives to center on the types of services that they're trying to provide without looking at potential connections. So, for example, how to embed the types of strategies and programs that you're looking to support into other initiatives that might be dealing with related issues, but without children exposed to violence being sort of the primary focus. So I think as part of your scan, looking for those other initiatives, those other coalitions that are working on related issues that you might be able to piggyback on and again, draw down some of those additional resources. A third suggestion is make sure that you've identified all the decision-making forums for distributing money and have connected with them. So, for example, block grants are distributed generally by bodies made up of multiple stakeholders to develop plans on how the money will actually be distributed to communities. So making sure that you've found all those bodies and have figured out how to make connections to them so you can influence decisions about how more discretionary money gets spent. And the fourth thing to think about is leveraging resources. So thinking strategically about how you can use current expenditures to tap into additional public revenue. So, for example, some communities have experimented with redirecting their funding for their initiatives to public agencies who are then able to use that funding to draw down matches from federal and state programs. So that would be a way to leverage private dollars to tap into otherwise unavailable sources of public funding. The third strategy is to build relationships with diverse partners. And so, again, I think one of the strengths of children exposed to violence is it provides, as an issue, is it provides you with connections to a broad range of stakeholders who are working on issues that include children exposed to violence, but also related issues, things like early childhood education, community policing and safety, housing and economic development. And so a couple of specific suggestions about how to build relationships with these diverse partners would be, first of all, make sure that you build a strong governance structure. And your governance structure should also be seen as a way to network with other stakeholders. And it also gives you a center point for other coalitions, other initiatives, other stakeholders to collaborate with. And I think one of the challenges to call out there is there's a dilemma when you're creating your governance structure of trying to create a standalone entity. So it can include diverse stakeholders versus locating your governance structure in a specific agency, whether that's a service provider or a public agency. And as you make that decision, one of the things to consider is how that affects your ability to reach out to other stakeholders and be a partner with other coalitions and initiatives. A second suggestion is to remember to connect across your state with other communities. So one of the first things I did when I was doing research on this particular initiative was to look at other initiatives that have worked on child traumatic stress and children exposed to violence to see what other resources were out there. So finding other communities that you can connect with that have had similar initiatives, I think, is one way to build those broader coalitions so you can access resources. And also remember to connect up with state agencies. So I think sometimes there's a tendency to focus more at the local level, but obviously a lot of decisions about funding are made at the state level. So looking at whether there are state programs and state initiatives that you can tap into and build partnerships with so you can have a say in how decisions are made at the state level about how resources are distributed. A third suggestion is to make sure to put the money on your board. So make sure that you've reached out to local foundations, things like the organizations like the United Way, maybe even the local Chamber of Commerce, to connect to stakeholders who have access, who actually have access and decision-making power about resources that you can tap into. The fourth suggestion is to build community awareness. So part of attracting partners is making sure that they know that you're out there. So things that communities have done to do this is engage the local media in longer-term coverage. So there are different examples of civic journalism efforts where the media doesn't simply report on the story, they, a particular story. They follow your initiative over time, doing a series of reports, and instead of just reporting the facts, play a more involved role in doing things like convening community meetings to talk about these issues and then reporting out on the results. Another example from the Urban Health Initiative is that several of the cities held candidate forums where candidates for public office would come and speak about public health issues, but specifically issues that affected the health of children and families. So in that way, they raised awareness about their work and their efforts. They did it in a nonpartisan way, but connected with local politicians and made sure that their issues were on the public agenda and that they had those connections to draw on no matter who won the particular campaign. Fifth suggestion here is to cultivate future leaders. And again, you're trying to think in the long term about how to sustain your initiative, and so obviously connecting with the executives who have control over decisions about how resources are distributed is important, but you also need to be thinking about 5 or 10 years down the road, who's going to be making those decisions and connecting with those folks. So other initiatives have done things that I've seen like creating institutes or training sessions, and they identify rising leaders who will eventually occupy those positions and build those connections with them at least a couple of years in advance through integrating them into their initiative. So remembering not to leave out folks who are working maybe in mid-level management, but who are clearly rising stars that will be important a few years down the road. All right, the fourth strategy is creating flexibility in existing revenue streams. And these are the strategies that I'm sure you've heard about, things like blending and braiding funding. And folks often ask, what's the difference between braiding and blending funding streams? So the first approach to creating flexibility would be braiding funding streams, which basically means coordinating different sources of funding to allow you to provide more comprehensive and integrated services. So, for example, family resource centers often do this by drawing down different sources of funding that allow them to create broader, more comprehensive programs for the populations that they're trying to serve. Another example would be locating these services in schools. So family resource centers located in schools are then able to access different funding streams that support educational programs and services